Officer James Mitchell sat in his police cruiser, watching cars pass by on Cedar Street. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel as his eyes scanned each driver. It was something he did every Friday afternoon, sitting in the same spot near the intersection where people rushed home from work. But Mitchell wasn't looking for speeders or drunk drivers. He had a different target in mind. At 45 years old, Mitchell had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 15 years. He wore his blonde hair in a military-style cut and kept his uniform perfectly pressed. To many people in town, he looked like the perfect example of a police officer. The shiny badge on his chest and the crisp blue uniform helped him hide who he really was. "Another one," he mumbled to himself, pulling up behind a black SUV driven by a young African-American man. Mitchell didn't even bother looking for a real reason to stop the car. He knew how to make up excuses that would sound good in his report later. Failed to signal properly, he would write, or suspicious driving pattern. After 15 years, he had learned all the right words to use. Back at the police station, everyone knew about Mitchell's habits. Some younger officers looked uncomfortable when he bragged about his arrests in the break room, but nobody said anything. Mitchell had friends in high places. The police union representative was his golf buddy, and he regularly had dinner with two of the senior sergeants. "Just doing my job," he would say with a smile whenever someone questioned his high number of arrests. "Keeping our streets safe." The fact that almost all of his arrests involved minorities was something nobody talked about openly. But things in Millbrook were about to change, even though Mitchell didn't know it yet. In a large office building downtown, Sarah Lawrence Wilson was working late at her desk. Papers were spread out in front of her. Dozens of complaints from Black and Hispanic residents about unfair treatment by police. As one of the few Black female attorneys in town, people trusted her with their stories. Sarah was no ordinary lawyer. She had graduated at the top of her class from law school and had won several big cases against powerful companies. But what made her even more special was something Officer Mitchell had no idea about. She was married to Captain David Wilson, the second highest ranking officer in the Millbrook Police Department. Their marriage wasn't a secret, but Sarah had kept her married name off her office door and business cards on purpose. She and David had talked about it when she first opened her law practice. "I want to succeed or fail based on my own work," she had told him. "Not because I'm the captain's wife." David had understood completely. Now, as the sun began to set outside her office window, Sarah added another file to her growing collection. A young Black college student had come to her that morning, crying as she told Sarah about being held at the side of the road for over an hour during a traffic stop. The officer's name in the report was James Mitchell. "That's the third complaint about him this month," Sarah said quietly to herself, making a note in her computer. She didn't know yet that she would soon have her own experience to add to the files. In another part of town, Captain David Wilson was packing his bags for a 3-day police conference in the state capitol. He kissed Sarah goodbye at their front door. "Be careful while I'm gone," he said, like he always did. Sarah smiled and straightened his tie. "I'm always careful," she replied. "You be safe too." Neither of them could have guessed what would happen in the next 24 hours. They didn't know that Officer Mitchell was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. They didn't know that his habit of targeting Black drivers was about to catch up with him in a way he never expected. As night fell over Millbrook, 3 different lives were moving toward a collision course. Officer Mitchell went home feeling proud of another day of what he called good police work. Sarah stayed late at her office, building a case against police discrimination. And Captain Wilson drove toward the state capitol, his phone turned off for the long drive ahead. The stage was set. Tomorrow would change everything. The next day started like any other for Sarah Lawrence Wilson. She spent the morning in court, won a small claims case for her client, and worked through lunch at her desk. By 6 in the evening, she was tired and ready to head home. The setting sun painted the sky orange as she got into her black Mercedes. Sarah always followed a strict routine when driving. She checked her mirrors twice, kept both hands on the wheel, and drove exactly at the speed limit. As a Black woman, she knew that even the smallest mistake could lead to trouble. Her husband David had taught her all the proper responses if she ever got pulled over. Keep your hands visible, move slowly, and stay polite no matter what. She was less than 10 minutes from home when she saw the police lights flashing in her mirror. Sarah took a deep breath and pulled over carefully, turning on her interior lights so the officer could see clearly inside her car. In her rearview mirror, she watched Officer Mitchell walk toward her car, his hand resting on his gun. "License and registration," Mitchell demanded, not even bothering to say hello. His flashlight beam hit Sarah's face directly, making her squint. "Of course, officer," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm going to reach for my purse to get my license. It's in the passenger seat." She moved her hand slowly, just like David had taught her. Mitchell snatched the documents from her hand. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "No, sir, I don't," Sarah answered truthfully. She had been driving perfectly, and they both knew it. "You were swerving?" Mitchell lied, his voice filled with fake concern. "Have you been drinking?" Sarah kept her voice steady. "No, sir. I don't drink. I'm coming from my law office downtown. I was driving straight and following all traffic laws." Mitchell's face changed when she mentioned being a lawyer. His friendly act disappeared. "Step out of the car," he ordered. "May I ask why, officer? I haven't done anything wrong." Sarah started recording on her phone, keeping it out of sight. "Out! Now!" Mitchell's voice got louder. "Or are you resisting?" Sarah knew her rights, but she also knew how dangerous this situation could be. She slowly got out of her car, keeping her hands where Mitchell could see them. The evening air was cold against her face. "Walk in a straight line," Mitchell ordered, even though he hadn't done any of the proper procedures for a sobriety test. Sarah did as she was told, walking perfectly straight in her high heels. "Officer, I'd like to call my husband now. This stop is unnecessary, and you haven't given me a valid reason." "Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job." Mitchell's face turned red. "Put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for drunk driving and resisting an officer." "I'm not resisting, and I'm not drunk," Sarah said clearly, making sure her phone was still recording. "This is an illegal arrest, and you know it." Mitchell roughly grabbed her arms and put on the handcuffs. "We'll see how smart you are down at the station." He didn't bother reading her rights or following proper arrest procedures. As Mitchell pushed her toward his police car, Sarah saw another police cruiser pull up. Officer Jenny Rodriguez stepped out, looking confused at the scene. "Everything okay here, Mitchell?" Rodriguez asked, clearly uncomfortable. "Just another drunk driver giving me attitude," Mitchell said loudly. "Call a tow truck for her car." Sarah looked directly at Rodriguez. "Officer, I need to report misconduct. Officer Mitchell is making an illegal arrest. I'd like to speak to the watch commander." Mitchell pushed Sarah into the back of his car before Rodriguez could respond. "Save it for the judge," he sneered, slamming the door. Through the window, Sarah watched Rodriguez stand uncertainly by her car. The young officer took out her phone, probably sensing something wasn't right. But Mitchell was already getting into the driver's seat, a satisfied smile on his face. As they drove toward the police station, Sarah stayed calm. She thought about the files on her desk, all the other people Mitchell had treated this way. She thought about her husband, David, who was probably giving his speech at the conference right now. And she thought about how this arrest was about to change everything in Millbrook. Mitchell had no idea he'd just arrested the captain's wife, but he was going to find out soon enough. The fluorescent lights at the Millbrook police station buzzed overhead as Officer Mitchell led Sarah through the booking area. Other officers looked up from their desks, some with surprise at seeing a well-dressed woman in handcuffs. Sarah held her head high, her heels clicking against the floor tiles. "Sit there and don't move," Mitchell ordered, pointing to a hard plastic chair near the booking desk. He was enjoying this moment, taking his time with the paperwork while Sarah sat handcuffed. Sergeant Pete Collins walked over to Mitchell's desk. "What's the charge?" he asked, glancing at Sarah. "Drunk driving and resisting arrest," Mitchell replied loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She was giving me attitude during the stop. You know how these people are." Collins looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. He'd known Mitchell for years and had seen this pattern before, but something felt different this time. The woman didn't look drunk at all. "I want my phone call," Sarah said calmly, "and I'd like to report misconduct by Officer Mitchell." Mitchell laughed. "Phone calls are a privilege, not a right. You'll get it when I'm ready." This was another lie. Phone calls were absolutely a right, and Sarah knew it. Officer Rodriguez walked in, carrying Sarah's purse and phone from her car. She placed them on the booking desk, then hesitated. "Mitchell, can I talk to you for a minute?" Later, he dismissed her with a wave. I'm busy teaching someone about respect for law enforcement. Sarah watched as Rodriguez walked away, then turned to speak to another officer in the corner. The young officer was doing the right thing, documenting everything she saw. Sarah made a mental note to remember that for later. Time passed slowly. Mitchell deliberately took over an hour just to start the booking paperwork, hoping to break Sarah's calm demeanor. But Sarah sat quietly, watching everything and everyone. She noticed how other officers kept looking at her with concern, how they whispered to each other, how some made phone calls and quickly hung up. "Stand up," Mitchell finally ordered. "Time for your mugshot." Sarah stood gracefully despite the handcuffs. "Officer Mitchell, you still haven't read me my rights or allowed me my phone call. Everything you're doing is being noted." Mitchell's face turned red again. "Turn to the right," he snapped, ignoring her words. "Now the left." After the mugshot, Mitchell started the fingerprinting process, pressing each of Sarah's fingers roughly against the scanner. He was so focused on trying to make her uncomfortable that he didn't notice the growing unease in the station. Officer Rodriguez had made several calls by now. So had Sergeant Collins. The watch commander, Lieutenant Garcia, had been notified and was on his way in. Something about this arrest didn't feel right to any of them. "Where's Captain Wilson?" One rookie officer whispered to another. "You should know about this." "At that conference in the Capitol," came the reply. "Won't be back until tomorrow." Sarah heard these whispers and kept her composure. She knew David's phone would be off during his presentation. She knew he wouldn't see any messages until later. But she also knew that when he did, everything would change. Mitchell finally finished the paperwork, making sure to list every possible charge he could think of. "Hope you're comfortable." He smirked at Sarah. "You'll be here all weekend. Judge won't be available until Monday." "That's incorrect," Sarah replied calmly. "There's a duty judge available 24/7 for probable cause hearings, as you well know." Mitchell's smirk faded slightly. He hadn't expected her to know that. "Well, look who knows so much about the law. Too bad it won't help you here." Just then, Lieutenant Garcia walked in. He took one look at Sarah and his face went pale. He knew exactly who she was. He'd been at her in David's wedding 3 years ago. "Mitchell," Garcia called out sharply. "My office. Now." "In a minute, sir," Mitchell replied, still focused on making Sarah uncomfortable. "Just finishing up here." "Now, Mitchell." Garcia's voice left no room for argument. As Mitchell walked toward the lieutenant's office, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The first cracks in Mitchell's armor were starting to show. Soon, they would break wide open. Captain David Wilson stood at the podium, finishing his presentation about community policing at the state conference. As soon as he stepped off the stage, he turned his phone back on. Immediately, it buzzed with dozens of missed calls and messages. "Sir," a young officer from his department ran up to him. "We've been trying to reach you for hours." David's heart stopped when he read the first message. His wife Sarah had been arrested. By James Mitchell. Without saying another word, he grabbed his coat and ran for his car. Back at the Millbrook police station, Mitchell sat in Lieutenant Garcia's office, defending his actions. She was drunk, resisting arrest. "Stop talking," Garcia interrupted. "Just stop. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "My job," Mitchell said firmly. "I don't care if she's some hotshot lawyer. The law applies to everyone." Garcia rubbed his temples. "Mitchell, that woman you arrested. That's Sarah Lawrence Wilson, Captain Wilson's wife." The color drained from Mitchell's face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in his 15-year career, Officer James Mitchell felt real fear. Out in the booking area, things were changing quickly. Sergeant Collins had already removed Sarah's handcuffs and brought her a cup of water. Officer Rodriguez sat with her, taking detailed notes about everything that had happened. "Mrs. Wilson," Collins said nervously, "we can release you right now. No charges." Sarah shook her head. "No, I want everything processed properly. Every illegal action Officer Mitchell took needs to be documented. This isn't just about me." The station doors burst open. Captain David Wilson walked in, still wearing his conference lanyard. His face was dark with anger. Every officer in the room stood up straight. "Where is she?" David's voice was calm, but everyone could hear the fury beneath it. "David!" Sarah stood up, and her husband rushed to embrace her. Are you okay? Did he hurt you? David checked her wrists where the handcuffs had been. I'm fine, Sarah assured him. But we need to talk about Officer Mitchell. This isn't the first time he's done this. It's just the first time he did it to someone who could fight back. David nodded, his jaw tight. Where is he? In my office, Garcia answered, with his union rep on the way. David turned to address the room. I want everything documented. Body cam footage, booking photos, paperwork. Every single thing Mitchell did tonight. No one goes home until it's done. Officers scrambled to comply. They all knew this was a turning point. Mitchell sat in Garcia's office, sweating. Through the window, he could see Captain Wilson holding his wife, the same woman Mitchell had treated so badly just hours ago, the same woman he had arrested for no reason except. Mitchell felt sick. For the first time, he saw himself through others' eyes. He saw every traffic stop, every false arrest, every time he'd abused his power. But this time, he couldn't hide behind his badge. The door opened. Captain Wilson walked in, his face unreadable. Mitchell jumped to his feet. Captain, I can explain. Sit down. David's voice could have frozen fire. The only reason you're not in handcuffs right now is that my wife insisted we follow proper procedures. The procedures you ignored when arresting her. Mitchell sat, his legs shaking. I didn't know she was your wife. That's the problem, isn't it? David's voice was quiet but intense. You thought she was just another black woman you could bully. Someone without power. Someone who couldn't fight back. You've been doing this for years, Mitchell. But it ends tonight. Please, Mitchell whispered. I have a family, a mortgage. So do all the people you've arrested illegally, David replied. Internal Affairs will be here in an hour. I suggest you think very carefully about every racist thing you've done wearing that badge. Because by the time we're done, you won't have it anymore. As David walked out, Mitchell slumped in his chair. Through the window, he watched Sarah talking to Officer Rodriguez, probably building the case that would end his career. His phone buzzed, his union rep telling him not to say another word. But Mitchell knew it was too late. His badge wouldn't protect him anymore. His house of cards was finally falling down. The next morning, the Millbrook police station was buzzing with activity. 2 internal affairs investigators, Roberts and Chen, had taken over the conference room. They sat at the long table, surrounded by files, computers, and coffee cups. Play the body camera footage again, Roberts said, leaning forward in his chair. On the screen, they watched Mitchell's traffic stop of Sarah for the 10th time. Every lie, every violation of procedure was clear as day. Jen took notes on her laptop. No probable cause for the stop. No field sobriety test procedures followed. Illegal arrest. Denial of rights during booking. She looked up at her partner. And that's just from last night. Captain Wilson had stepped aside from the investigation, knowing he couldn't be involved. But before he did, he made sure the investigators had everything they needed. Check every traffic stop Mitchell made in the last 5 years, he had told them. Every arrest, every complaint. Sarah sat in her office downtown, her phone ringing constantly. Word had gotten out about Mitchell's arrest of the captain's wife, and people wanted to tell their stories. Her assistant worked quickly to schedule appointments with everyone who called. Another one, her assistant said, sticking her head in the door. James Mitchell gave this man a false drug charge last year. Lost his job because of it. Cases got dismissed, but the damage was done. Sarah nodded, adding the information to her growing file. She had been building this case against Mitchell for months, but now people weren't afraid to speak up anymore. The wall of silence was breaking down. Back at the station, Officer Rodriguez sat with the investigators, sharing everything she had seen. It wasn't just last night, she explained. Mitchell had a pattern. He targeted people of color, made up reasons to stop them. Some of us tried to report it, but nothing ever happened. Roberts pulled up Mitchell's personnel file on his computer. Look at this. 27 complaints in 15 years, all marked as unfounded or resolved without action. He shook his head. Someone was protecting him. Chen was going through Mitchell's traffic stop data. In the last year alone, 85% of his arrests were minorities. In a town that's only 30% minority population. She made another note. This isn't just a few bad stops. This is systematic discrimination. In another room, Sergeant Collins nervously gave his statement. Yes, I knew what Mitchell was doing, he admitted. We all did. But he had friends in high places. Anyone who spoke up got shut down. Names, Roberts demanded. We need names. As Collins started talking, more officers came forward. They had stayed quiet for years, afraid of retaliation. But now, with internal affairs involved and the captain's wife building a civil rights case, the truth was pouring out. Mitchell sat in his home, suspended without pay. His phone had been ringing too. Other officers who had covered for him over the years, now wanting to save themselves. His union representative had already told him the best he could hope for was a resignation deal. Criminal charges were coming. Sarah met with David for lunch at a small cafe away from both their offices. How many victims so far? He asked. 43, Sarah replied, pushing her salad around her plate. And more coming forward every hour. Mitchell ruined lives, David. People lost jobs, homes, families because of his false arrests. David reached across the table and squeezed her hand. And now they'll get justice. Because of you. Because he finally arrested someone he couldn't intimidate, Sarah corrected. But this isn't just about Mitchell. The whole system that protected him needs to change. Back in the conference room, Roberts and Chen added another stack of files to their collection. Mitchell's case was expanding beyond just one racist officer. They were finding other problems, other officers who had helped cover up misconduct. This is going to be big, Chen said, looking at the growing mountain of evidence. Career-ending big. Roberts nodded, reaching for more coffee. Good. Sometimes the whole tree needs to come down, not just one bad apple. Outside the station, news vans were starting to arrive. The story of how a racist cop's false arrest of the captain's wife had exposed years of systematic discrimination was too big to ignore. Change was coming to Millbrook, whether the old guard was ready or not. 1 week after Sarah's arrest, Mitchell sat in his lawyer's office, staring at the papers spread across the desk. Each page showed another piece of evidence against him, his body camera footage, his arrest records, his text messages with other officers about targeting minority drivers. It's bad, his lawyer said plainly. The district attorney is filing criminal charges. Multiple counts of civil rights violations, false arrest, abuse of power. He slid another paper across the desk. And that's just the criminal side. Mrs. Wilson is filing a class action lawsuit with 48 other victims. Mitchell wiped sweat from his forehead. What are my options? Not many, the lawyer replied. The police union has dropped you. Your former friends at the department are all making deals to save themselves. The best I can do is negotiate a plea bargain. Outside the lawyer's office, the story had exploded. Local news stations camped outside the police station, interviewing people who had been targeted by Mitchell over the years. Their stories were heartbreaking. He arrested my son on fake charges, one mother told the cameras, crying. My boy lost his college scholarship because of it. Now Officer Mitchell is finally getting what he deserves. Sarah worked late into the night, preparing the civil lawsuit. She had gathered statements from dozens of victims, showing how Mitchell's actions had damaged their lives. Lost jobs, broken families, destroyed reputations. Each story made her more determined to see justice done. David faced his own challenges at the police department. Some officers were angry about Mitchell's arrest, saying Sarah had played the race card to get him in trouble, but most supported the changes David was making. We're installing new dashboard cameras in all patrol cars, he announced at a staff meeting. Body cameras stay on during every interaction. No more convenient technical problems during traffic stops. Officer Rodriguez had become a key witness. She sat with Internal Affairs for hours, explaining how Mitchell and his friends had pressured younger officers to stay quiet about misconduct. He told us this was how real police work was done, she testified. If we complained, we were labeled as troublemakers. Some good officers quit because of it. Mitchell's former friends abandoned him quickly. Sergeant Collins made a deal to retire early in exchange for his testimony. 2 other officers were suspended for helping cover up Mitchell's false arrests. The old system of protection was crumbling. The district attorney called a press conference. Today, we are filing criminal charges against former Officer James Mitchell, she announced to the crowd of reporters. This case reveals a disturbing pattern of racist behavior and abuse of power. We will prosecute to the fullest extent of the law. In his home, Mitchell watched the press conference on TV. His wife had taken their kids to stay with her parents. His neighbors avoided him. 15 years of power and privilege were gone in just 1 week. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer, DA offering a deal. 5 years prison time, must testify against others involved. Let me know ASAP. Mitchell's hands shook as he read the message. Prison. The word he had used to threaten so many innocent people was now hanging over his own head. At the police station, David hung a new poster in the break room. It showed the department's updated mission statement: to protect and serve ALO citizens with equal respect and dignity. Below it, he added a confidential tip line number for reporting officer misconduct. Sarah met with more victims in her office. This lawsuit isn't just about money, she explained to them. It's about changing the system, making sure this never happens to anyone else. They nodded, many of them crying. For years, they have felt powerless against Mitchell's badge. Now they were finally being heard. The sun set over Millbrook, but lights still burned in offices across town. Lawyers prepared court documents. Investigators reviewed evidence. Journalists wrote stories. Mitchell's arrest of Sarah had cracked open something much bigger than one racist cop. Change was happening, file by file, statement by statement, truth by truth. The reckoning had come to Millbrook, and nothing would be the same again. The courthouse was packed on the first day of Mitchell's trial. News cameras lined the steps outside, and every seat in the courtroom was filled. Mitchell sat at the defendant's table in a gray suit that seemed too big for him now. He had lost weight during the 3 months since Sarah's arrest. District Attorney Maria Santos stood before the jury. This case is about power and racism, she began. About a police officer who thought his badge gave him the right to destroy lives. We will show you evidence of dozens of illegal arrests, all targeting people of color. Mitchell's lawyer tried to paint a different picture. My client is a dedicated officer with 15 years of service, he argued. One incident is being used to smear his entire career. But the evidence told the real story. Day after day, witnesses came forward to testify about Mitchell's actions. A young college student spoke about missing finals because of a false arrest. He planted drugs in my car, the student testified. I lost my scholarship, had to drop out. All because I was black and driving a nice car. A grandmother told the jury about being handcuffed in front of her grandchildren. He said I ran a stop sign. There wasn't even a stop sign on that street, but he knew nobody would believe me over a police officer. Officer Rodriguez testified about the culture of silence Mitchell had created. He taught rookie officers that this was normal police work, she explained. If we reported him, our careers would be over. Sarah's testimony was the most powerful. She sat in the witness stand, calm and professional, and described every detail of her arrest, the illegal stop, the false accusations, the denial of her rights. Officer Mitchell didn't know I was the captain's wife, she told the jury. He didn't know I was a lawyer. He saw only one thing, the color of my skin, and he thought that meant he could abuse his power without consequences. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Sarah played the recording from her phone. His voice filled the courtroom, dripping with contempt as he arrested her without cause. The prosecution showed charts of Mitchell's arrest records. 85% of his arrests were minorities, Santos explained to the jury. In a town that's less than 30% minority population, these numbers tell a clear story of targeted racism. Former Sergeant Collins testified as part of his deal. Yes, we covered up complaints against him, he admitted. Yes, we knew it was wrong. We were part of a system that protected bad officers instead of the public. Mitchell's lawyer tried to challenge each witness, but the evidence was too strong. Body camera footage, arrest records, text messages. The truth was impossible to deny. On the 10th day of the trial, Mitchell finally took the stand. His voice shook as he tried to defend himself. I was just doing my job, he insisted. Fighting crime, keeping the streets safe. Safe for who? Santos asked during cross-examination. Safe for the black student who lost his future? Safe for the grandmother humiliated in front of her grandchildren? Safe for Mrs. Wilson, who you arrested for being black in her own neighborhood? Mitchell had no answer. He stared at his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. In the gallery, David sat with Sarah every day, watching justice being done. Other police officers came to support them, wearing new pins that read, "Protect and Serve Everyone." The jury took only 4 hours to reach their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood. On the charge of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of false imprisonment, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of abuse of power under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. Mitchell slumped in his chair as the verdicts continued. Each guilty was another nail in the coffin of his career, his freedom, and the corrupt system he had represented. Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood with other victims, holding hands as they faced the cameras. "This verdict sends a message," she told reporters. "A badge is not a license for racism. Power comes with responsibility, and justice, though delayed, will come for those who abuse that power." The sun was setting over Millbrook as Mitchell was led away in handcuffs, the same way he had led away so many innocent people. But this time, the handcuffs served justice instead of racism. 1 year after Mitchell's conviction, the Millbrook Police Department looked very different. Captain David Wilson, now promoted to Chief Wilson, stood in front of the new Community Oversight Board. The room was filled with citizens from all parts of town, coming together to make their police department better. "Our arrests are down 40%, David reported, but our community trust is up. Every officer now gets extensive bias training. Body cameras stay on, and most importantly, every complaint is investigated fully." Sarah sat in the audience, smiling proudly at her husband. The class action lawsuit she had led against the department had ended in a $5 million settlement for Mitchell's victims. But money wasn't the most important change. "The settlement requires complete reform," she explained to a group of law students who now interned at her office. "New hiring practices, regular audits of traffic stops and arrests, a citizen review board with real power. We're making sure no other officer can do what Mitchell did." Mitchell himself sat in a prison cell, serving his 7-year sentence. His wife had divorced him, and most of his former friends pretended they had never known him. Late at night, he read letters from people whose lives he had damaged, part of his required restorative justice program. Officer Rodriguez, now promoted to Sergeant Rodriguez, led the department's new community outreach program. She visited schools and community centers, building trust between police and citizens. "When I was a rookie, Mitchell taught us that good police work meant making lots of arrests," she told a group of new officers. "Now we know that good police work means protecting everyone's rights, building trust, serving all citizens equally." The young college student who had lost his scholarship because of Mitchell's false arrest was back in school. The settlement money had allowed him to return to his studies. He was now majoring in criminal justice, planning to become a civil rights lawyer like Sarah. "She showed me that the law can be a force for good," he told his classmates. "That justice is possible if we fight for it." In the police station break room, a new poster hung where Mitchell's arrest photos used to be. It showed faces of all colors, with words that read, "To protect and serve means to protect and serve everyone." Below it was a plaque listing the names of officers who had received commendations for community service. Sarah's law practice had grown. She now led a team of lawyers specializing in civil rights cases. People came from other cities to learn from what had happened in Millbrook. "One bad officer didn't create the problem," she explained at a law conference. "A whole system allowed that officer to abuse power for years. Changing the system is harder than removing one person, but it's the only way to create real justice." David brought changes to every level of the department: regular mental health checkups for officers, community feedback sessions, anonymous tip line for reporting misconduct that was actually investigated. The old guard who had protected Mitchell were gone, replaced by officers who believed in equal justice. "My wife's arrest was painful," he told a newspaper reporter, "but sometimes it takes pain to bring healing. What Mitchell did to her, he had done to countless others who couldn't fight back. Now nobody in our department can do that again." The grandmother who had been handcuffed in front of her grandchildren now served on the Citizen Oversight Board. Her grandchildren attended police athletic league events, no longer afraid of officers. "Things aren't perfect," she said at a board meeting. "Change takes time, but at least now we have a voice. At least now we have hope." One evening, Sarah and David walked through their neighborhood, holding hands. A police car drove past, and the officer waved friendly at them. Sarah waved back, no longer tense at the sight of flashing lights. Do you think Mitchell learned anything? Daggett asked quietly. Sarah thought for a moment. Maybe, maybe not. But the important thing is that the system learned. The department learned. The city learned. And now we're teaching others. They stopped to watch the sunset over Millbrook. The city wasn't perfect, but it was better. What had started with one racist traffic stop had led to real change. Because one woman was strong enough to stand up, brave enough to fight back, and determined enough to turn her pain into progress. Justice had come to Millbrook, not just for Sarah, but for everyone.